The more observant of you may have realized that this is actually the same text that I preached on last time I was in this pulpit. And it's not because it's one of my core scriptures, and it's not even the lectionary for today, but it is the sacred story, along with a few sacred stories from more recent times, that inspired the mural in progress downstairs. Speaking of the mural, I hope that you'll join us after worship to add to it. And don't worry, what you're wearing is great. There's actually no paint involved today, so it's all going to be good. Come eat lunch, don't paint with us, use chalk with us. As Toph mentioned, I've been working with the Sanctified Art for the past 7 years, creating art and worship resources for churches like ours. It's been a blessing, especially with a small child, to be able to work remotely and largely on my own schedule. We don't even have a central office, but if we were to have a spiritual home as a team, it would be Black Mountain, North Carolina. Black Mountain, a small mountain town, as the name implies, is outside of Asheville and neighbors the popular Montreat Presbyterian Retreat Center. It's our founder, Lyle's hometown. And it's where we've gathered for our annual in-person retreats the past few years. And we'll walk to local coffee shops and restaurants. And we always have to stop at least once on the way to greet some old friend. It's a beautiful, charming town. And in 2024, it was devastated by Tropical Storm Helene. The mountains of North Carolina aren't used to severe weather, much less hurricanes. But as our oceans heat up, the weather becomes more unpredictable and angrier. We knew a big storm was headed their way, but we could not have imagined Helene. The storm raced through the Swannanoa Valley, creating catastrophic flooding and leaving devastation in its wake. And when the wind and rain finally stopped, there was no power, no clean water, no cell signal. The roads were completely impassable. But that didn't stop the neighbors from walking out their front doors, gathering and checking on one another to compare needs and resources. Lyle and her family made their way to their church, Black Mountain Presbyterian, which had become a makeshift gathering spot by the time they arrived. Despite the lack of power and running water, volunteers were already emptying the church freezers, cooking up whatever they could before they spoiled using the gas stoves. And hungry people started gathering. They started lining up, eager for a hot meal, while the pastor ran back and forth between people, taking notes on what else they needed that she might be able to find. Melting ice provided cold, clean drinking water. People brought the food from their own freezers to add to the makeshift feast. The church was really living into its new mission statement, which was adopted just days before the storm. God's timing really is funny. Writes Lyle, in 2022, I joined the strategic planning committee for my church. Like many churches, we were discerning a new mission statement, one that could be embedded within the life of our community and not just a bunch of words that no one paid attention to. Through a long committee process, we struggled to identify a new vision statement that felt relevant and authentic. One day, a committee member pointed to the question carved into our communion table: has everyone been fed? He asked, what if that was our mission statement? We collectively pondered this idea, a question as a mission statement? We unpacked it some more and listed all the ways our church feeds people in body, mind, and spirit. We decided the question was also a charge. Our work is always ongoing. We can't get complacent. Like good Presbyterians, we submitted the new mission statement to the church session for approval, which means the entire process moved very slowly. By September 2024, we were finally ready to present the new mission statement to the church. On September 22nd, 2024, our head pastor, Reverend Mary Catherine Robinson, preached on the new mission statement with a sermon titled, "The Time is Now." A few days later, on September 27th, Hurricane Helene wreaked havoc on our mountain town and the surrounding areas of North Carolina. As I said, isn't God's timing funny sometimes? In the weeks that followed the adoption of their new mission statement, "Has everyone been fed?" Black Mountain Presbyterian Church fed thousands in the wake of Helene. And there was no planning committee, no budget assessment. They simply saw the need and they met it, trusting that there would be plenty to go around. And there was. Donations, both monetary and in kind, came pouring into the church, which acted as a distribution hub for all sorts of needs. They continued cooking meals, 3 meals a day, until the Rail Yard, a local restaurant, was able to take over operations on that front. They organized and distributed groceries, personal hygiene items, diapers, formula, over-the-counter medications, clothing, constantly reevaluating needs and supplies. Young adults, many of whom could not go to work in the aftermath of the storm because their job did not exist, formed a service corps to provide disaster relief. The church met financial needs once rent and bills came due, thanks to over $2 million of donations from all over the country. The people of the Swannanoa Valley came to Black Mountain Presbyterian Church because they were hungry, not just for food, but for community, for connection with people who understood and who shared their trauma. They were hungry for hope. They were hungry for a way to serve their neighbors. And in the fellowship hall of a historic church building, they were filled. This story is not unlike a couple of our own sacred stories at UBC. When I was a child, we still had the good old-fashioned Wednesday night supper and Bible study, a Baptist classic. Some of y'all who have been around UBC for a while might remember playing Stump the Pastor with Larry or being greeted by Mary Bolden in the alley vestibule. Every week, we'd hand over a few dollars for the meal and head down into the fellowship hall. Every now and again, being located where we are, someone would come in from the alley with an empty belly and no way to pay. And the cashier that night would say, "That's all right, come on in, there's always plenty." Well, word eventually got around, and more hungry people came to our doors. And so soon we had to decide what to do. It's the same choice that the disciples and Jesus are faced with in this story. As they come to Bethsaida, they are physically and emotionally exhausted. Jesus has sent the 12 out 2 by 2 into the countryside to preach and to heal, telling them to take nothing but the clothes on their back, just rely on the kindness of strangers. In the midst of this, John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin and torchbearer, the one who prepared the way for his ministry, has been beheaded by Herod. The disciples have been depleted. Jesus has been traumatized. So when the disciples return, Jesus brings them to a quiet, deserted place to rest and to regroup and to process everything that's happened. They really need this break. But the crowds follow him as they always do, presenting Jesus with a choice. So what will he do? As exhausted and depleted as he is, he has compassion on them. One version of this story says, "For they were like sheep without a shepherd." So he heals and teaches, and despite impossible odds, he feeds them. So, as Christians, that's what we did too. We shifted our budget and operations, starting a whole new meal service on Thursday nights, which we called God's Family Dinner. And a quarter of a century later, this is still one of the core ministries of UBC. It started because people were hungry. It persisted because they've been filled, not just with food, but with community and hope and dignity. Because while food is great, especially when Fatty's cooking, it's not always the point. The thousands on the hillside were probably getting hungry for dinner, but that's not why they originally followed Jesus out into the desert. They were hungering for hope, for healing, for someone who saw their humanity in the midst of an oppressive empire that reduced them to nothing. It's a hunger we share. There's a song we used to sing at Labyrinth Worship called "We Share a Hunger." It goes like this. We share a hunger for justice in our world, that all may find joy, all may find wholeness, all may find peace. We share a hunger to feel the light of Christ shining through us, shining on all, bringing God's reign. It's this hunger for God's reign of justice that brings us back to 2024. Now, there's an adage that says that you should preach from your scars, not from your wounds, and so my apologies if the following story is a little raw or disjointed or incomplete. We're working with a scab at best here, definitely not a scar, but it's a story that needs to be told. On April 29th, 2024, I got an email from Natalie asking for volunteers to come to the church to be ready to staff UBC as a respite center for the student protesters. Just days earlier, DPS had arrested dozens of students for protesting the university's financial support for the state of Israel, and the students were pushed off campus. UBC opened our doors for the students to have a safe place to regroup and store their signs and process what had happened. We wanted to be a place of refuge for them, to be their own Bethsaida. The charges were all eventually dropped by the DA, and the students, undeterred by the threat of force or suspension, returned to the South Mall. Now, if you've only read about this story in the news, you may not have realized what was happening on the lawn. You might be picturing students shouting and holding signs, but that's not all that was happening. There were poetry readings, screen printing workshops, and teach-ins where people could learn about the history of the conflict in Palestine. The goal was not to agitate, but to educate, to spread awareness of the suffering in Gaza. It was a largely positive, gentle, and peaceful gathering until DPS showed up again. When I received the email from Natalie, I headed up to UBC, ready to welcome the students with big mama bear energy, as is my spiritual gift. I headed to the front doors and watched with Rowena from the steps as state troopers assembled across the street. We watched the signal chat closely and learned that dozens of students had been arrested and loaded into a transport van. That van was headed through campus toward the intersection of 22nd and Guadalupe, where I had just seen men in cowboy hats loading rifles. Any student who had not yet been arrested was headed toward the intersection to block the van's exit. My heart still pounds and my hands still shake when I remember these moments. The roar of the approaching crowd grew, and then shouts turned to screams when DPS unleashed pepper spray on the students. Rowena and I prepared for the flood of people as best we could, who were running across the street to the safe haven of UBC stores. Water bottles were poured onto burning eyes. Street medics had to delegate and teach while they were treating the most severe burns. Photojournalists snapped pictures of the chaos. Mama bear mode kicked in as I went to go get clean shirts and more water, more saline, more dish soap, more towels. I learned to treat pepper spray injuries and directed students to the lost and found as we quickly became the repository for the arrestees' belongings. My pastoral care training had not prepared me for this, but I learned as I went how to best care for the people who came through our doors. I'm still processing the trauma of that afternoon, and I want to be very clear that I was a privileged bystander in a safe place, protected by both my social and physical location from any danger. My experience cannot hold a candle to what the students faced that April. Protesters were arrested, suspended, assaulted. For the days and weeks and months following, they'd be dealing with the aftermath, navigating the legal system, being approached by journalists not knowing what to say, processing the physical, mental, and emotional trauma. In the wake of April 29th, the students were hungry for justice and healing and community. I imagine the people who came to Jesus were hungry for the same. We kept the respite center open every night for a while for students to regroup and pick up their things. Rowena, Katie, Natalie, and I took turns watching the door and closing up. We welcomed volunteers from sister congregations across the street and across the city. Chefs showed up to cook meals for the students who were finding refuge in the fellowship hall. Other professionals showed up to lead workshops on navigating the legal system, street medic first aid, speaking to journalists. And the question once again arose, what will we do? How do we make this sustainable? Just as before, we answered, we'll feed them. We'll feed them, not just their bellies, but their hearts and their minds and their souls. We'll treat them with dignity. We'll hold space for whatever they need. We'll provide safe haven where community can flourish. We will be the hands of Christ, blessing and breaking bread until all have been filled. It's these sacred stories of provision, compassion, and care that inspire the mural downstairs. If you haven't gone downstairs to see it yet, I can kind of describe a little bit of it to y'all. I kept the rainbow rays that y'all love so much in the organ chamber mural, and I added a couple of things. The rest we'll add this afternoon. First, a central image of hands breaking bread, reminding us that Christ commands us to, as often as we eat the bread and drink the cup, do this in remembrance of me. As often as we eat the bread and drink the cup, not just when we celebrate communion in the sanctuary, not just when we gather in the fellowship hall to eat on Wednesdays or Thursdays or Sundays, but every time we break bread together is a chance to remember Christ. Second, a phrase from the scripture turned into a vision statement that's painted at the top. Until all have been filled. Because, church, our work is not done until all have been filled. All bellies, all hearts, all souls, all the broken places. But don't worry, there's always plenty to go around. Thanks be to God. Amen.